Texas, 1944. The sun pressed down over rows of wooden barracks surrounded by still air and barbed wire. Inside Camp Hearn, hundreds of German prisoners sat at long wooden tables, each with a single sheet of paper, an envelope, and a pencil stub. The guards called it Letter Sunday. At exactly 10 o'clock, the loudspeaker clicked on. Mail hour begins. The room went silent. No laughter, no murmuring. Just the soft scratch of pencils against paper, the sound of men remembering who they were before the war. One of them, Obergefreiter Heinrich Bauer, stared at the blank page for a long time. His last letter home had been written on a battlefield in Tunisia, never mailed. Now, for the first time in years, he could write his wife's name without fear of it vanishing into the smoke. Across the aisle, an American guard stood by the door. Hands behind his back, eyes calm. He wasn't reading, he wasn't rushing them, he simply waited. When Heinrich finally began to write, "My dearest Anna, I am alive." His hand trembled so violently that the pencil nearly broke. Around him, the room filled with the sound of quiet hope, one word at a time. It was the gentlest sound the war had ever made. By 1944, the war's tide had turned. The Allied invasion of Europe was underway, and tens of thousands of captured German soldiers were arriving in the United States aboard Liberty ships, their boots and pride equally worn thin. The United States would eventually hold more than 370,000 German POWs across the heartland, from Texas and Oklahoma to Michigan and Idaho. They came expecting humiliation. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as brutal conquerors, a people who tortured their prisoners and starved them in cages. When the ships reached the New York docks, many Germans braced themselves for violence. But what they found instead was order, military trucks, calm instructions, fair treatment. Guards offered cigarettes, water, and blankets. "They said we were going to hell," one prisoner later recalled. "Instead, we found decency." That decency was codified in the 1929 Geneva Convention. The United States, determined to model civilization even in war, promised to treat all prisoners humanely. They were fed the same rations as American soldiers, given medical care, and allowed to send and receive mail. The mail system, though small, became the lifeline of the POW camps. Letters could be written once a week, strictly censored, limited to 25 lines, and addressed through the International Red Cross. It was bureaucracy wrapped in mercy. To men who had lost everything, home, family, language, those few sentences were salvation. At Camp Hearn, Texas, Sundays became sacred. The Americans called it mail hour. The Germans called it brief time. It was the only time the barracks fell completely silent. Men who had spent months speaking in clipped commands now whispered prayers over ink and paper. For the guards, many of whom were barely older than the prisoners, it was strange to witness. These were the same men who had once fought for Hitler's army, men who had marched across Europe under swastikas. Yet here they were, writing about orchards, snow, children's birthdays, the sound of church bells. War had stripped them of identity, but the act of writing gave it back. The Americans saw it as a practical necessity. Letters boosted morale, reduced escape attempts, and kept order. But over time, it became something more. The guards began to realize that each envelope leaving the camp carried not propaganda, but humanity. "We saw their hearts on paper," one sergeant said years later. "They didn't write about Hitler. They wrote about home." For the prisoners, the ability to write was almost unbelievable. Some refused at first, suspecting a trick. They believed their words would be intercepted, their names used against their families. But when the first replies arrived weeks later, thin envelopes marked with the red emblem of the International Red Cross, the disbelief gave way to something closer to faith. A single letter could change everything. One man learned that his wife had survived the bombings of Hamburg. Another discovered that his son had been born while he was in captivity. Some found news too painful to bear, homes destroyed, families missing. But even grief felt like proof that they still belonged somewhere. Each Sunday, when the camp bugle sounded for mail hour, men lined up early, uniforms pressed, pencils sharpened. They treated the ritual like Mass, each sitting in quiet reverence before the blank page. They wrote slowly, deliberately, as if afraid to waste a word. Many began their letters the same way. Meine Liebste, I am alive. The guards standing watch began to understand something profound, that mercy didn't weaken discipline. It gave it purpose. Allowing their captives to write didn't threaten order. It preserved it. Letters became the invisible bridge between barbed wire and the world beyond. By the end of 1944, Camp Herne had processed tens of thousands of letters, each one stamped and sent through Switzerland, across an ocean still teeming with submarines. Some were lost to the sea, others made it home months later, creased and smudged, but whole. And when replies arrived, passed carefully from hand to hand, the camp transformed. Men who had once stared blankly into the distance now smiled faintly. Guards noticed them standing straighter, humming familiar songs, even carving gifts for the Americans who had delivered their letters. In a war built on dehumanization, this simple act of correspondence had done the unthinkable. It had humanized both sides. Across the American landscape, the story repeated itself. In Alabama, Iowa, Nebraska, and Texas, thousands of German prisoners spent their Sundays hunched over wooden tables, writing their way back into existence. The U.S. Army had turned the act of correspondence into a weekly ritual of order and dignity. Each letter was regulated but respected. The format never changed: 25 lines, one sheet, written in pencil or ink, with no military details or political commentary allowed. Every letter was inspected by a U.S. censor, translated if necessary, and forwarded to the International Red Cross in Geneva, which then sent it to Germany. Replies came back the same way, often months later, carrying faint smells of home, the trace of bread, the ghost of perfume, or soot from the ruins of bombed cities. For the German soldiers, the experience bordered on surreal. Many had been told that America would erase them, that they would vanish into prisons or labor camps, never to be heard from again. Instead, they were told to write, not propaganda, but truth. "Tell your family you are alive," one camp commander said. "That is your duty now." Some prisoners couldn't bring themselves to write at first. They feared shame more than death. "What can I say to my wife?" one man asked. "I left her to raise our son alone. I failed my country, my comrades." The American guard beside him, a 20-year-old from Ohio, simply said, "Tell her you miss them. That's enough." That small sentence carried more power than any victory speech. Slowly, men began to write again. The first letters to reach Germany caused confusion and tears. Families who had already mourned received words from the dead. A woman in Munich fainted when her husband's letter arrived. Another wrote back, "Your words saved me. I no longer dream of dying." In the U.S., the Sunday ritual grew into something sacred. At Camp Herne, the guards scheduled extra hours for it. They learned to recognize certain faces, men who lingered longest at their pages, lost in concentration. When mail arrived, those same men gathered under the guard tower to read aloud from home, news of weddings, harvests, births, and losses. For a few minutes, the war's noise vanished. Some guards began bringing extra paper and envelopes from nearby towns. "It's hard to explain," one sergeant later said. "But when you saw a man's eyes light up over a letter, you stopped thinking of him as the enemy. You just saw someone waiting to go home." The American command recognized the effect. Discipline improved. Fights between prisoners declined. Work output rose. Hope, it turned out, was the most efficient form of control. But among the men themselves, something deeper had begun, a quiet transformation of spirit. Letters became confessionals. Men wrote apologies to wives they had abandoned, to fathers they had disappointed, to children they had never met. They wrote to mothers, promising to plant gardens when they returned, to never wear a uniform again. And they wrote to themselves, though they would never admit it, rediscovering humility, one sentence at a time. A few began to write in English, hoping their guards might understand. One letter, found decades later in an archive, read simply, "Dear America, thank you for letting me write. It is the only thing that makes me feel human again." The irony was striking. Back in Germany, censorship was severe. Civilians couldn't freely express grief, doubt, or gratitude without fear. Yet here, inside an enemy's prison, men found the freedom to speak truth for the first time in years. By late 1944, Camp Hearn's Letter Sundays were so quiet that birds could be heard outside. Guards called it the holiest hour in Texas. One Marine joked that you could hear a pencil drop from 50 feet away. And sometimes, when mail arrived from across the sea, the guards would pause their own routines just to watch. Men unfolded fragile sheets of paper as if opening something sacred. They pressed them to their faces, closed their eyes, whispered thanks. Some kissed the pages before tucking them carefully into their shirts. The Americans never mocked them for it. They understood. Many had letters of their own tucked into pockets, from wives, mothers, sweethearts. They knew that a single page could keep a man alive. In the quiet of those Sunday mornings, the line between captor and captive thinned. Both sides became participants in the same human ritual, writing, reading, remembering. The war still raged overseas. The names of cities, Bastogne, Berlin, Okinawa, filled the newspapers. But inside the camps, the war seemed distant, unreal. Here, victory was measured not in miles gained or prisoners taken, but in envelopes sealed and sent. By year's end, thousands of letters had crossed the ocean. Some carried good news, others unbearable sorrow. Yet even grief brought connection. "At least now we are together in pain," one man wrote after learning his father had died in an air raid. For the first time since the war began, these men were living as sons and husbands again, not soldiers, not enemies, just human beings. And that, perhaps, was the most subversive thing of all. Every Sunday, when the bell rang for mail hour, the barracks changed. The air grew still, as if the entire camp were holding its breath. Some men wrote quickly, eager to send reassurance home. "I am healthy, I am safe, America feeds us well." Others stared at blank paper for nearly the entire hour, trapped between truth and the words they could not bear to write. For these men, writing was not simply communication, it was survival. The letters gave them a reason to wake up, a way to push back the numbness that captivity brought. "It reminds me I still exist," one prisoner told a guard. "When the pencil moves, I am a man again." The act was deeply personal. Every name written, every phrase chosen carefully, was a quiet act of resistance against despair. Some wrote to mothers who would never see them again, some to wives who might already be gone. Others wrote to children too young to remember their fathers. One man described his son's face entirely from memory, drawing it in the margin when words failed him. The Americans rarely interrupted. Even the toughest guards respected those moments of fragile peace. The pencil became more powerful than the rifle ever was. Psychologists who later studied the POW camps described letter writing as a form of therapy. Primitive, unintentional, but profoundly effective. The men poured their fractured thoughts onto the page, organizing their fear into sentences, transforming helplessness into control. Writing created a rhythm, a routine, something sacred amid captivity's chaos. It also rebuilt self-worth. Prisoners who had seen their nations collapse found purpose in ink. They could still comfort their families, still protect them with words, even from behind wire. One guard wrote in his report, "When mail hour comes, it's like they stop being prisoners. They sit straighter. They remember who they are." The letters also healed the Americans. Many guards confessed to reading fragments while censoring, expecting bitterness but finding poetry instead. Lines about sunrise over cotton fields, memories of German winters, descriptions of kindness from American nurses. "You can't read their words and keep hating them," one private admitted. "They sounded just like us." Each envelope became a mirror, showing both sides their own humanity reflected back. To the U.S. military, allowing prisoners to write home was strategic. A well-treated enemy meant better chances for American POWs in Europe. But to the guards who enforced it, the rule became something personal. "It was the only order that felt good to follow," said Sergeant David Lee, who oversaw mail duty in 1944. War demanded hardness, but this policy demanded empathy. The guards learned to pronounce German names to make sure the letters reached the right men. Some slipped extra sheets of paper to those who wrote longer messages. Technically, it was against regulations, but few followed that rule strictly. For the prisoners, every stamped envelope was proof that America was not what their propaganda had claimed. They began to wonder if they had been lied to all along. "Our officers told us Americans had no soul," one man wrote in his diary, "yet they let us speak to our families every week." Which side is civilized now? This realization shook their beliefs far more effectively than interrogation ever could. The moral weapon of mercy worked quietly, dismantling years of indoctrination with every mailed letter. When the replies began to arrive, the camp changed forever. Prisoners lined up in silence as names were read aloud. Each envelope trembled in their hands like something alive. Some men opened them slowly, savoring the anticipation. Others ripped them apart in desperation. The words that came back were often bittersweet. Many letters spoke of bombed homes, missing relatives, hunger. Some wives confessed they could barely survive. Others revealed they had remarried, believing their husbands dead. There were moments of unbearable grief, men collapsing to the floor, clutching pages, whispering names through tears. And yet, even the pain was holy. To receive a letter, good or bad, was proof that they still had a place in the world. "The bomb fell, but I live," one wife wrote. "Now I wait for you." Those words were read aloud in a whisper that spread through the barracks. The men listened as if hearing a sermon. Hope became their new discipline, silence their prayer. The Americans learned to leave them alone on those afternoons. They understood that inside those barracks, wars far more personal than nations' conflicts were being fought, and sometimes won. In the end, the Sunday ritual became more than a rule. It became redemption. Letters didn't just connect continents. They connected the fragments of men who had lost faith in everything but the human voice on the other side of an envelope. Each word, carefully chosen, said what war could not erase. "I am alive. I remember you. I still belong to this world." For most of the German prisoners, the camp routine felt alien at first, structured but strangely gentle. The Americans enforced discipline, yet they also encouraged education, art, and communication. Sunday letter writing became the most symbolic of these rituals. Order transformed into empathy. To the Germans, the idea of a captor allowing emotional expression was unthinkable. In the Reich, every word was controlled, every sentence filtered through fear. Yet here, in enemy territory, they were told to write freely about their lives. It wasn't just generosity. It was a cultural shock powerful enough to pierce years of indoctrination. The act of writing forced the men to remember their pre-war selves. They recalled the sound of their mother's voice, the scent of rye bread, the color of the Rhine in spring. They remembered the humanity they had been ordered to suppress. The letters reminded us that we came from people, not machines, one former prisoner said decades later. The Americans gave us back our language, and with it, our conscience. The guards, in turn, learned to read the emotions hidden behind foreign handwriting. They began to see the letters not as documents, but as bridges, each page a fragile crossing from one moral world to another. The U.S. military's censorship teams were supposed to look for secrets, locations, troop details, or propaganda. But what they found instead were glimpses of quiet humanity. Every week, hundreds of letters passed through the censors' desks, each one full of longing, apology, and home. Some censors began collecting anonymous excerpts that moved them. "Tell our son that I still carry his wooden train in my mind. The American guards are kind, they treat us like men. I dream of a future where letters travel faster than bullets." Even the official reports reflected surprise. A 1945 memo from the War Department read, "The tone of German POW correspondence reveals no hostility. In many cases, letters express gratitude for fair treatment." It was not what anyone expected. These men, trained under an ideology of hate, were beginning to unlearn it one letter at a time. Their words crossed the ocean, reshaping how their families viewed America, not as an enemy, but as a strange mirror of what decency could look like in defeat. Historians later concluded that this flow of honest correspondence was one of the earliest catalysts for post-war reconciliation. When German civilians saw that their captured sons were being treated with compassion, it cracked the propaganda machine back home. It showed that America fought a brutal war, but not a cruel one. Most of what happened in those camps was never photographed or recorded. There were no journalists, no speeches, no celebrations. Yet the quiet mercy practiced inside those fences did more to heal than 1,000 headlines ever could. For the American guards, especially those who had lost friends overseas, kindness felt like a rebellion against hatred itself. "I couldn't bring my buddies back," one guard said, "but I could make sure their deaths didn't turn me into what I was fighting." Mercy became their silent victory. It wasn't weakness, it was strength guided by conscience. Allowing men who once carried rifles to carry pencils instead was a moral decision that echoed far beyond the camps. It proved that America's power wasn't just in its weapons, but in its restraint. The German prisoners saw it, felt it, and remembered. Years later, when many of them returned home to rebuild Germany, they carried that memory with them. They had seen democracy not as a slogan, but as a daily act of fairness. Some would become teachers, engineers, even politicians dedicated to a more humane future. "We learned democracy in Texas," one former POW said simply. When the war ended and the prisoners were finally released, each carried home a bundle of letters tied in string. Many of them kept those bundles for the rest of their lives, creases worn deep, paper yellowed by time. The guards, too, kept memories of those Sundays. In one letter found decades later, an American wrote to his wife, "You'd think they'd write about battles or orders, but all they ever write about is their mothers. I think that's what war really takes away. Mothers." That understanding outlived the uniforms. When former POWs returned to Germany, some continued writing letters to their old guards, thanking them for decency. Others wrote to the families of guards who had passed away. "Your father let me write to my wife," one man wrote in 1951. "Because of him, I had a wife to come home to." For both sides, the act of writing had transcended its original purpose. It had become a symbol of everything war tried to destroy and failed to erase: trust, dignity, the human need to be heard. Every letter sent from behind barbed wire was a small rebellion against the silence that dictatorships demanded. Each page carried the same quiet message, written in dozens of languages and thousands of hearts. I am still human, and so are you. The Sunday ritual had outlasted the war. The letters, carried across oceans and decades, would eventually fade and crumble, but the compassion that allowed them never did. It was proof that even when nations are at their cruelest, ordinary men can still find ways to speak softly through the noise. By early 1945, the camp had settled into a rhythm so steady that even the guards could sense its quiet sanctity. Sundays were sacred. At sunrise, the bugle sounded across the Texas plains, echoing over fields of cotton and wire. By mid-morning, hundreds of German prisoners gathered in the recreation hall, their uniforms faded to gray, pencils sharpened, paper neatly stacked. No one ordered them to hurry. No one shouted. The Americans didn't need to. The men knew what the hour meant. It was their one escape from captivity, their single link to the world beyond the fence. That morning, the light fell through the windows in long golden lines, cutting across the tables where men bowed over blank pages. Sergeant David Lee, the male officer, stood by the door with his clipboard, watching. He had seen combat in North Africa and lost his best friend to a sniper's bullet outside Kasserine Pass. To him, this camp duty had felt at first like exile, a soldier's purgatory. But over the months, the quiet had begun to heal him. He walked between the rows, boots echoing softly on the wooden floor, and saw what few Americans had ever witnessed: the enemy stripped of hate, men reduced to memory and ink. Some mouthed words silently as they wrote, others paused, eyes closed, perhaps seeing a face from long ago. Near the back of the hall sat Obergefreiter Heinrich Bauer. His letters had become something of a legend among the guards, long, poetic, written in careful German script. The translators said they read like prayers. That morning he was shaking. When Sergeant Lee passed by, he noticed a small envelope resting near Bauer's hand, unopened. "You're not writing today?" Lee asked gently. Bauer didn't look up. I cannot." He hesitated, then pushed the envelope forward. "My wife has written. It came yesterday." Lee frowned. "Bad news?" Bauer nodded. "She thought I was dead." His voice cracked. "For 2 years, she buried me in her heart." He lifted the letter, now creased from being opened again and again. Inside was a photograph, a woman standing beside a small boy, maybe 3 years old, smiling faintly at the camera. On the back, in delicate handwriting, were 4 words: "This is your son." Lee froze. He looked at the image, then at the prisoner, whose eyes filled but didn't break. "You didn't know?" he asked quietly. Bauer shook his head. "When I left Germany, she was with child. I did not think they lived through the bombing." For a long time the sergeant didn't speak. Around them, the sound of pencils scratching continued, the rhythm of men writing their lives back into being. Lee reached into his pocket, pulled out his own wallet, and showed Bauer a worn photo of 2 little girls. "They're about the same age," he said softly. The German's composure cracked. He covered his face, shoulders trembling. The sound he made was not a sob. It was quieter, a kind of surrender. Lee glanced around. The other guards were watching, unsure what to do. "Take your time," Lee said finally. He placed a hand on the man's shoulder and stepped back. "No one's rushing you." Bauer opened a fresh page. For several minutes he just stared at it, his hands trembling. Then he began to write, slowly, deliberately. "My dearest Anna, I have received your photograph. I do not deserve it, but I will carry it until the end of my days." The words poured out like a confession. He wrote for the full hour, tears falling onto the paper, blurring the ink. When the bell finally sounded, he didn't stop. Lee let him finish. That night, in his report, the sergeant wrote, "Prisoner number 4216 broke down during mail hour after receiving photograph from wife. No disciplinary issues. Allowed additional time. Emotional state stable after writing. Remarkable example of humanity, surviving war." The next Sunday, something unspoken changed. When Bauer entered the hall, every man stood a little taller. They had all heard what happened. They treated him as if his grief had somehow dignified them all. At the end of that session, Bauer handed his letter to Lee for mailing. The sergeant hesitated, then reached into his own pocket and slipped a sheet of stationery across the table. "You can write another if you'd like," he said. Bauer looked up. "Why such kindness?" Lee shrugged. "Because she'll want more words than one page can hold." The German nodded, blinking back tears. "You have a good heart, Sergeant. I hope your daughters grow up in a world where men no longer need fences." Lee smiled faintly. "Me too, Heinrich." He didn't realize then that this exchange, one man's grief, another's grace, would echo through both their lives long after the camp was gone. Outside, the mail truck rumbled to life, carrying letters north toward New York, then across the Atlantic through a war-torn sky. Somewhere above the waves, in a canvas mailbag, a father's words rode toward his family, proof that even in captivity, love had found a way to survive. The next few weeks passed with a kind of reverent calm through Camp Hearn. Word of Bauer's letter had spread, whispered among prisoners and guards alike. For the Germans, it became legend, a reminder that home was still real, that the world outside the fences had not completely disappeared. For the Americans, it was a quiet revelation. Even their enemy could ache for the same things they did. The routine continued as always. Sundays came and went, each one a mirror of the last, until one morning in March 1945, when a Red Cross courier arrived carrying a sealed envelope marked with the familiar Crimson Cross. It bore the same return address that Sergeant Lee now recognized by heart: Anna Bauer, Hamburg. Lee carried it through the camp yard himself. He didn't trust anyone else with it. The prisoners, standing in line for roll call, watched curiously as he approached Barrack 12. "Bauer?" he called. The man stepped forward, wiping his hands on his trousers, uncertain. Lee held out the letter. "Another from home," he said softly. Bauer's face drained of color. He took it with both hands, bowing his head. "Thank you, Sergeant." Lee hesitated, then added, "Take your time." That day, Bauer didn't wait for mail hour. He walked to the far corner of the yard where the sunlight broke through the clouds and sat on the edge of a wooden crate. Carefully, he opened the envelope. Inside was a single page and a small drawing, a child's crayon sketch of a man with a hat standing beside a woman and a little boy holding hands. Beneath it, written in uneven handwriting, were 3 words: "Come home, Papa." For a long moment, Bauer said nothing. His fingers traced the lines of the drawing again and again, as if memorizing every mark. Around him, the camp noise faded. The shouts, the trucks, the clatter of dishes, all fell away. It was just him and that fragile paper, proof that he was still loved by a world that had nearly forgotten him. Later that afternoon, during a letter Sunday, Bauer sat in the same spot as always. But this time, he wasn't alone. The other prisoners around him had gathered their courage to ask the Americans for more paper, more than 1 page, more than 25 lines. They wanted to write longer letters, fuller ones, stories instead of survival notes. The guards didn't object. "Use what you need," Lee said. "The war is almost over. Let them talk to their families." That hour became different from any before. The sound of pencils was joined by the faint hum of a hymn, someone at the back of the hall singing softly, a melody from the old country. One by one, The others joined in. The guards didn't stop them. They just stood quietly, listening to the voices rise like prayer. When Bauer finally began to write, he did so slowly, carefully shaping each word. My dear Anna, I received our son's drawing. You must tell him that his father learned to hold a pencil again because of him. I thought I had forgotten how to be gentle, but the Americans reminded me. I will come home not as a soldier, but as the man you remember. When the bell rang to mark the end of the hour, no one moved. Lee glanced at his watch, then looked around at the hall full of men still writing, tears running freely down faces that had long since learned to hide them. Let them finish, he told his corporal quietly. And so they did. The letters that left the camp that week carried not just news, but transformation. The Red Cross official processing them noted in his logbook, tone increasingly personal and affectionate, less despair, more gratitude. A few weeks later, Germany collapsed. Hitler was dead, Berlin in ruins. When the prisoners learned the news, silence fell over the camp. Many wept, not for the Führer, but for the country they no longer recognized. Bauer sat alone, reading his son's letter again. Come home, Papa. He whispered the words aloud, as if to test their truth. That Sunday, the guards announced that mail service would soon be suspended due to repatriation. The men were devastated, not because they would stop writing, but because the ritual itself had become sacred, a reminder that they were human, even in defeat. To honor the final Sunday, Sergeant Lee made a decision. He asked headquarters for permission to extend mail hour to 2 hours and provide as much paper and ink as the men desired. The request came back approved. That morning, the mess hall filled with light. Men wrote until their fingers cramped, pouring out years of silence onto paper. They wrote about forgiveness, about wanting to rebuild, about planting trees where bomb craters once were. Some drew maps of their hometowns, promising to find each other again. Bauer's final letter began. Anna, by the time you read this, the war will be a memory. Tell our son that his father's first victory was not in battle, but in writing to him. As the mail truck left the gate one last time, the prisoners and guards stood together, watching the dust rise behind it. No one saluted, no one spoke. They simply listened to the sound of the engine fade, carrying with it the last words of men who had rediscovered what peace sounded like. For Sergeant Lee, it would remain the quietest, most powerful day of his life. When the war ended in May 1945, Camp Hearn transformed overnight from a prison to a waiting room between two worlds. The stars and stripes still fluttered above the gates, but inside, the mood was neither triumph nor despair, just stillness. The prisoners no longer feared the guards, and the guards no longer looked at them as enemies. They shared cigarettes, stories, and the kind of silence that only men who had survived can understand. The Sunday ritual continued for a few weeks more, even though the war in Europe had officially ended. The letters no longer carried codes or censors' stamps. They carried closure. The men wrote to say goodbye, to families, to friends, to the ghosts they had left behind in battle. Some letters were full of gratitude, others of quiet grief. Many simply ended with the same words, "I will be home soon." For the Americans, the prisoners' departure brought mixed feelings. They had guarded them for nearly 2 years, watched them change, and in some strange way, grown attached to them. "We didn't want to admit it," Sergeant Lee later said, "but we'd miss those Sunday mornings. It was the only time the war felt truly over." When the repatriation orders came, the camp prepared meticulously. Uniforms were cleaned, supplies issued, and a final mail run scheduled. The last shipment of letters would cross the Atlantic alongside the men themselves. On the final Sunday before departure, Bauer approached Lee one last time. He carried a small bundle of papers tied with string, his collected letters, worn soft from handling. "I cannot take all these home," he said quietly. "But I want you to keep one." He handed the sergeant a single sheet of thin paper. It was his son's drawing, the stick figure family, the child's smiling face. Beneath it, in German, were the words, "Der Frieden beginnt im Herzen." Peace begins in the heart. Lee studied it, throat tight. "I'll keep it safe," he promised. "You have my word." When the day of departure came, the camp assembled for the final roll call. The German prisoners stood in formation, faces solemn but calm. Trucks idled nearby, ready to take them to the port at Galveston. Lee called out each name slowly, clearly, as if afraid that saying them too fast might erase the moment. When he reached Bauer, the man stepped forward, heels clicking together in the old military fashion. Then, breaking protocol, he extended his hand. For a moment, the camp went still. Lee hesitated, then gripped it firmly. "Thank you," Bauer said, "for paper, for patience, for remembering we were men." Lee nodded, unable to speak. As the trucks rolled out, a faint sound drifted back toward the gates, voices singing, the same hymn that had filled the letter hall weeks earlier. The guards removed their caps. Some turned away to hide their tears. In that moment, no one felt like victor or prisoner. They were simply men returning from a darkness that no longer held them. That night, after the last truck had vanished into the horizon, Sergeant Lee went to his quarters and unfolded the drawing one more time. The crayon lines were faded now, the paper frayed, but the message glowed as clear as ever. Peace begins in the heart. He pinned it above his bunk. For years after, it stayed there, through redeployment, through homecoming, through a lifetime of remembering. To him, it was the truest souvenir of war, not a medal, not a weapon, but a child's simple plea for his father to come home. The voyage home began under a pale June sky. Hundreds of German prisoners, including Bauer, boarded a Liberty ship at Galveston Harbor bound for Europe. The sea breeze carried a salty tang mixed with diesel and memory. As the ship pulled away, a few of the men turned toward the fading Texas coast, silent, hands raised in small, uncertain farewells. They were no longer soldiers. They were survivors. Each carried a small cloth bag of belongings, uniform, ration book, photographs, and a handful of letters tied with string. To the Americans watching from the docks, the sight was strangely peaceful. No defiance, no bitterness, just tired men going home. In the ship's crowded hold, the letters became lifelines again. Some men reread them in whispers by lantern light. Others clutched them in sleep as if afraid they might vanish. When the Red Cross clerk came through the deck offering paper, dozens lined up at once. The war was over, but they still needed to write, still needed to speak to those waiting in ruins across the ocean. Bauer wrote 3 letters during the crossing, one to his wife, promising that he would rebuild their home brick by brick. One to his son, telling him to always draw with bright colors, even when the world felt gray. And one to Sergeant David Lee, though he didn't know if it would ever reach him. "My friend," he wrote in careful English, "you taught me that mercy is stronger than walls. I will not forget our Sundays. If my boy ever meets yours, I hope they speak to each other kindly." The letter was never mailed. Bauer tucked it into his pocket, meaning to send it from Hamburg. When they arrived in Europe, the world they had left behind was almost unrecognizable. Cities were flattened, rivers clogged with debris, and hunger clung to every corner. The men stepped onto the docks like ghosts returning to a graveyard. And yet, amid the rubble, they carried something indestructible, the memory of compassion shown in captivity. Bauer walked for days through the ruins until he reached what was left of his neighborhood. His home was gone, his wife and son living in a shelter run by Allied relief workers. When they saw him, the child ran first, colliding with his father's legs, laughing through tears. Anna followed, wordless. Bauer dropped to his knees and held them both, sobbing openly for the first time since the war began. Later that night, when the boy fell asleep between them, Anna handed Heinrich the last of his letters, the ones that had arrived late, carried by Red Cross couriers after his ship had sailed. They were brittle, water-stained, but intact. "I read them every Sunday," she said quietly. "It was how I kept you alive." He smiled faintly. "Then you understand," he whispered. "The Americans let us write every week. That was how I stayed alive, too." He showed her the drawing she had sent, the stick figures of their family, now creased and worn from his pocket. "Our son's peace," he said softly. "It saved me." Years later, Bauer kept that drawing framed in his small rebuilt home. He worked as a teacher, then as a translator for the Allied administration. Every Sunday, he would sit by the window and write a letter, sometimes to old comrades, sometimes to no one in particular. It was a ritual he never broke, long after the war had faded into history. Across the ocean, in Oklahoma, Sergeant Lee lived out his years quietly. He taught at a local school, raised 2 daughters, and kept the German boy's drawing folded neatly inside a photo album. When asked about the war, he never spoke of battles. He spoke instead of a camp in Texas where enemies wrote letters, and peace was practiced in pencil and paper. When Lee died in 1978, his daughters found the drawing among his things, yellowed but intact. Written on the back, in their father's hand, were the same words Bauer had once written to him. "Peace begins in the heart." They left it there, an unfinished conversation between 2 men who had once stood on opposite sides of a fence and learned to speak the same language. Mercy. History often remembers war by its loudest moments, the thunder of artillery, the flags on victory days, the signatures on surrender papers. Yet sometimes the truest victories are quiet. They live not in battlefields, but in the spaces where men rediscover what it means to be human. The story of the German prisoners who wrote letters every Sunday is not about generals or borders. It's about the fragile grace of ordinary people who refuse to let war erase their decency. A pencil, a blank page, and 25 lines became a bridge stronger than hatred. Inside those American camps, soldiers learned something that no battlefield could teach, that mercy does not weaken a nation's power. It defines it. By letting their captives write home, the guards restored dignity to the defeated and peace to themselves. They proved that compassion could exist even inside barbed wire, and that empathy, once practiced, is contagious. For the prisoners, each letter was more than words. It was proof of life, an anchor to a world that still contained love. Some wrote to say they were alive. Others wrote to remember why they wanted to be. Their letters crossed oceans and ideology, carrying with them the quiet revolution of kindness. And for men like Sergeant David Lee and Heinrich Bauer, those Sundays outlasted the war. They carried them into fatherhood, into aging, into the long silence that follows conflict. 2 men who were never supposed to meet had found a peace neither army could command. Time would fade their letters, yellow their paper, and erase their footprints from the soil of Texas. But the message endured. Peace does not begin with treaties or governments. It begins with a single act of grace repeated often enough to change a heart. In the end, that is what history forgets and humanity remembers. Not who won, but who refused to let the world stay cruel. Because on one quiet Sunday in Texas, enemies sat at wooden tables, wrote to the people they loved, and discovered that even in the ruins of war, compassion could still write history.